My old Toyota Camry rolled to a stop between two gleaming machines of wealth, my father's Bentley and my mother's Mercedes. For a moment, I sat in silence, watching my breath fog the windshield. I had performed this ritual for 8 Christmases: park the old car, walk into the glittering mansion, sit at the table's farthest edge, and endure the same condescending smiles, the same carefully wrapped humiliations. They thought I had grown used to it, that the daughter they called a failure would keep swallowing their cruelty, year after year. But scars don't fade. They sharpen, they transform, until one day they become the sharpest weapon of all. Through the window, I saw them already in place. My father presiding at the head, my brother glowing in his tailored suit, my mother laughing as though the world revolved around her. They believed tonight would be no different. Another performance of the perfect Bennett family, with me as the punchline. But this year the script has changed. The question they never tire of asking still broke. Bonnie is about to ignite a fire they cannot contain. And within these walls, under the glow of 100 Christmas lights, my family will learn that what they thought was a dinner is really a reckoning. The December air cut sharp against my skin as I left the Camry and straightened my blazer. The driveway glittered with reflections from the mansion's thousands of white Christmas lights, each bulb glowing like it had something to prove. I tightened my grip on the leather purse at my side. Inside it was the only thing I would ever need to break this family's illusion of superiority, but not yet. Timing was everything. 8 years. The number beat in my chest like a second heartbeat. 8 years since the night I graduated from Harvard Business School with honors diploma still warm in my hands, only to hear my father's judgment disguised as wisdom. You need humility before you're ready for responsibility. His words had been smooth, deliberate, spoken with the certainty of a man who had never been questioned in his life. I was meant to nod to obey, to thank him for shutting the door in my face. 8 years since my mother followed up his cruelty with a softer blade. She picked up the phone and, in her delicate, deliberate way, called every bank that might have considered me. She destroyed my career without ever raising her voice. Patricia Bennett didn't shout. She simply smiled and said, "She isn't ready. Spare her the humiliation." Boston's elite never ignored Patricia Whitmore Bennett. By the time she hung up, my reputation had been strangled in its crib. What she never realized was that her sabotage had forced me to build my own. Wings in silence. She thought she was saving me from shame. In truth, she was forging her own undoing. My phone buzzed, the screen lighting up in the dark. Izzy Chen, my COO, my compass, my only real friend since Harvard. Marcus hired a PI. He's close. Tonight has to be perfect. A laugh almost slipped from my throat. Of course Marcus was suspicious. My brother had always been the sharpest of them, though our parents never gave him credit for it. Stanford MBA, a vice president at Dad's bank by 35. The heir apparent who never stumbled. The golden boy. The son who could do no wrong. If anyone could piece together the trail leading from S. Bennett at Bennett Capital Holdings. Back to me, it would be Marcus. But I had been preparing for him, too. The year grandfather Thomas rolled a check across the chessboard in his study, a quiet $2 million gesture disguised as a gift. Build something they can't ignore, he'd said. He was the only one who believed in me, the only one who understood what it felt like to be underestimated. From a one-room office in Cambridge, surrounded by mismatched chairs and buzzing fluorescent lights, I began building what would become a revolution. Artificial intelligence for underwriting. Blockchain for transparency. Microloans for neighborhoods no traditional bank would touch. A new model of finance born from the fury of being told no. While my family clung to mahogany desks and century-old rules, I built a machine that ate those rules alive. And while it grew, I wore my mask. $45,000 a year at a community bank, just enough to keep the Camry running and the illusion alive. Every holiday, I arrived like a penitent child, presenting myself as the family failure. I let my parents apologize for me at galas. Let them speak about me like I was a footnote. Let them sneer at my thrift store clothes. Each humiliation filed itself away. Another brick in the wall I was constructing for this very night. The phone buzzed again. A number I knew. Detective Ray Morrison, FBI. I let it ring into silence. For 6 months, I had been feeding him evidence against Marcus' offshore transfers. Wire trails through Bermuda Cayman shell companies, stacked like Russian dolls. Marcus thought he was clever. He had no idea his little sister had been documenting his every step. Whatever Morrison wanted tonight could wait. I had my own performance to deliver. Through the frost-glazed windows of the mansion, I caught a glimpse of the scene inside. My father, Richard Bennett, anchored at the head of the living room like a king holding court, lecturing on traditional banking values. My mother, resplendent in emerald silk, fluttered from guest to guest, a social butterfly feeding on admiration. Marcus, tall and polished in his bespoke suit, accepted compliments with the air of someone already wearing his father's crown. And in the corner, Grandfather Thomas sat in his wheelchair, eyes sharp despite his years watching. Always watching. They had no idea. No idea that their carefully rehearsed tableau of family perfection was about to collapse. The oak door opened before I could knock. My mother's silhouette filled the doorway, diamonds glinting at her throat, smiles smooth as porcelain. "Welcome home, sweetheart," she said, as though the word home hadn't been denied to me for years. "We thought perhaps you'd changed your mind about joining us." For one breath, I simply studied her. The woman who had crippled my career with a few phone calls, who'd smiled while twisting the knife. Then I let my own smile surface polished, practiced, the kind I had used to dismantle CEOs in boardrooms without them realizing they were already beaten. I wouldn't miss Christmas dinner for the world, Mom. Inside, the air was heavy with pine garlands, wood polish, and expensive perfume. The chandeliers blazed, ornaments glittered. The grand staircase wrapped in gold ribbon. Everything screamed curated perfection. But beneath the shine, I could already feel the tension. Hairline cracks in a flawless facade. I shrugged off my coat, letting it fall over the banister. My purse stayed at my side, heavy with the magazine inside. To anyone else, it was just glossy paper. To me, it was the scalpel that would slice through decades of arrogance. Proof that the family failure had become the force none of them had seen coming. I stepped into the living room, heels sinking into thick Persian rugs, the murmur of my family's laughter washing over me like cold water. They didn't pause, didn't rise. To them, I was still the afterthought. Still the disappointment. And maybe that was why my chest didn't ache the way it used to. Not anymore. I wasn't here for their approval. I wasn't here for their love. I was here to burn the script they had written for me and write my own. 8 years of silence, 8 years of patience, 8 years of wearing the mask they handed me. Tonight, the mask would finally come off. Tonight, their Christmas Eve performance would end in ruin. While I was adjusting my coat in the marble foyer, my brother Marcus was 3 floors up in Dad's mahogany-paneled study, frantically typing on his laptop with the kind of desperation I'd only seen during our Harvard finals week. If I could have seen him then, hunched over financial documents with sweat beading on his forehead despite the December chill. But Marcus had made his choices just like the rest of my family. He'd spent the last 3 hours diving deeper into Bennett Capital Holdings than any outsider should have been able to go. The private investigator he'd hired, some ex-cop named Jimmy Torino, who specialized in corporate espionage, had delivered his preliminary report that afternoon. What should have been routine due diligence on a competitor had turned into something far more unsettling. Marcus scrolled through page after page of SEC filings, his Stanford MBA training finally proving useful for something other than impressing investors at cocktail parties. Bennett Capital Holdings had been acquiring small stakes in regional banks across New England for 3 years. Nothing large enough to trigger federal oversight, nothing obvious enough to raise red flags, but persistent enough to form a pattern. And the pattern was pointing directly at Bennett Trust Bank. The company had purchased 12% of his family's bank over the past 2 years, using a network of shell companies and investment funds that would have made his money laundering clients proud. Whoever was running Bennett Capital Holdings understood financial structures better than most Wall Street veterans. His phone rang, the sharp tone cutting through his growing paranoia. "You sure the CEO is someone named S. Bennett?" his PI asked without preamble. No photos anywhere on the company website, no public appearances, no interviews. Very unusual for a company this size. Marcus wiped his palms on his pants. "What else did you find? The education background checks out. Harvard Business School, graduated 2014. Same year as your sister, actually." Weird coincidence. Marcus felt his stomach drop. It wasn't a coincidence. Nothing about this was a coincidence. "Keep digging," he said, ending the call before Torino could respond. He pulled up Bennett Capital Holdings' founding documents. Incorporated in Delaware in March 2016, just 3 months after Bonnie had been rejected for her 3rd banking job in Boston. The same month she'd finally accepted that community bank position in Cambridge, claiming she needed to start somewhere. 3 floors below, I could hear Mom's voice carrying from the kitchen. That particular tone she used when she wanted to sound important. "I had to call those banks personally," she was saying to Maria, our longtime housekeeper. "You understand, don't you?" I couldn't let her embarrass the family name with amateur mistakes. Better she learn humility first. If Maria had opinions about my mother's version of tough love, she kept them to herself. She'd been with our family for 15 years, long enough to know when to nod and when to stay quiet. "I saved my family's reputation," Mom continued, arranging white roses in a crystal vase. "Sometimes a mother has to make difficult choices. Look how well it worked out." Bonnie learned to be realistic about her limitations. Back in the study, Marcus was learning about limitations of his own. Every document he opened, every transaction he traced, every corporate structure he unraveled pointed to the same impossible conclusion: the mysterious S. Bennett, who'd built a financial empire worth $2.8 billion, wasn't some Harvard wonderkind he'd never heard of. It was his little sister. The sister who drove a beat-up Toyota and lived in a studio apartment in Somerville. The sister who wore discount store clothes and brought homemade cookies to family dinners because she couldn't afford expensive gifts. The sister who asked naive questions about banking regulations and technological innovation questions everyone assumed proved her ignorance. Marcus pulled up Bennett Capital Holdings' client roster, accessible only through a leaked document Torino had acquired from a disgruntled employee. The names read like a Fortune 500 directory: Tesla's CFO. 3 different cryptocurrency exchanges. The startup that had revolutionized mobile payments. Companies that wouldn't trust their money to anyone without an impeccable reputation and cutting-edge technology. His hands started shaking. The garage door rumbled below, signaling Dad's return from his afternoon drive. Richard Bennett had a habit of taking his vintage Porsche for a spin whenever family dinners approached, claiming he needed to clear his head before dealing with Bonnie's negativity. "That damned Camry is parked crooked again." Dad's voice boomed through the house. Bonnie never learned proper respect for anything. Marcus almost laughed. Respect. If what he was discovering was true, Bonnie had built something that deserved more respect than their family bank had earned in its entire century-long history. He opened another file, this one containing Bennett Capital Holdings' recent acquisitions, a fintech startup in Austin, a blockchain security company in San Francisco, a European digital bank that specialized in serving underbanked populations. Each purchase had been strategic, building toward a comprehensive financial ecosystem that made Bennett trust. Bank services look antiquated. His laptop chimed with an email notification. The subject line made his blood run cold. Pemberton Industries wire transfer. Inquiry. Marcus opened the message from his lawyer, a man who charged $800 an hour to keep questionable transactions from becoming federal cases. Marcus need to discuss the Pemberton routing ASAP. Some unusual inquiries from the federal level. Can you explain the Tuesday transfer through the Cayman subsidiary specific? Amount $2.3 million. Someone has very detailed information. Call immediately. The room started spinning. That Tuesday transfer was supposed to be completely confidential. Only 3 people knew the specific routing and amount: Marcus, Thomas Crawford at Pemberton, and whoever had processed the wire transfer on the receiving end. But Bonnie couldn't possibly know those details. She worked at a community bank that probably handled car loans and small business accounts. She didn't have access to international wire transfer systems or offshore banking networks, unless she did. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Stop looking or start running. Your choice." He stared at the screen, reading the message 3 times before it registered. Someone knew he was investigating Bennett Capital Holdings. Someone knew he was getting close to the truth. Someone wanted him to stop. He heard footsteps on the stairs, the familiar click of Mom's heels against hardwood. She was coming to collect him for cocktails before dinner. The same ritual they'd followed every Christmas Eve since childhood. "Marcus, darling," she called from the hallway. "Time to come down and be social. Your sister just arrived and we need to present a united family front." United family front. The irony was suffocating. He closed his laptop and took a deep breath, trying to compose himself. Whatever was happening, whatever Bonnie had become, he needed to be careful tonight. No accusations, no confrontations, just observation. But as he stood up from Dad's leather desk chair, his phone buzzed again. Another text from the same unknown number. "See you at dinner, big brother." Marcus felt the color drain from his face. He looked around the study, suddenly paranoid that someone was watching him. The tall windows faced the street, but their house sat far enough back that no one could see inside. Could they? He walked to the window and peered through the heavy curtains. Bonnie's Toyota was still parked between the luxury cars, looking as out of place as always. But now Marcus wondered if that was intentional. If everything about his sister's apparent failure was as carefully constructed as Bennett Capital Holdings' corporate structure. The house felt different as he walked downstairs. Like the walls themselves were keeping secrets. Every family portrait, every piece of inherited furniture, every symbol of Bennett legacy suddenly seemed fragile, as if it could all disappear with the right revelation at the right moment. He found his family gathered in the living room, drinks already poured, conversation flowing with the practiced ease of people who'd been performing the same roles for decades. But when Bonnie looked up from her wine glass and smiled at him, Marcus saw something he'd never noticed before. She looked exactly like someone who'd been planning something for a very long time, and tonight that something was finally ready to begin. The living room looked like a Norman Rockwell painting crossed with a Tiffany catalog. Our massive Christmas tree dominated the corner, dripping with ornaments that had been in the family for generations, each one worth more than most people's monthly salaries. Under the tree sat an arrangement of elegantly wrapped gifts that looked more like a magazine photo shoot than an actual family Christmas. This was my favorite part of the evening. The gift exchange that revealed so much about how my family really saw each other. I reached into my canvas tote bag, the same one I'd carried to my community bank job for 3 years, and pulled out my carefully selected presents. Each one had been chosen for maximum psychological impact. For Mom, I'd found a wool scarf at a discount retailer, the kind of scratchy synthetic blend that would make her skin crawl. I'd even left the $12 price tag on, tucked discreetly under the tissue paper where she'd definitely find it. Dad got a leather bookmark embossed with some generic inspirational quote about success, the kind of gift you buy at an airport newsstand when you've forgotten someone's birthday. $23 marked down from $35. But Marcus received something special. A pair of cufflinks I'd had custom made by a jewelry designer in the financial district. They looked like cheap knockoffs of expensive cufflinks, complete with slightly tarnished gold plating. But if he looked closely, really closely, he'd notice the tiny logo etched into each one. The Bennett Capital Holdings logo, scaled down to fit on a surface smaller than a dime. "Let's open presents," Mom announced, settling into her throne-like wingback chair with the kind of anticipation that suggested she was expecting gratitude, not genuine gifts. I watched as she unwrapped my scarf, her smile becoming more strained with each fold of tissue paper. "Oh, honey," she said, holding the synthetic material at arm's length like it might contaminate her. "Thank you for this lovely scarf. I'm sure it's very warm." The fabric quality seemed questionable, even from where I sat, but I just smiled innocently. "I wanted to get you something practical," I said. "Something you could actually use instead of just admire." Dad opened his bookmark with the kind of forced enthusiasm he usually reserved for disappointing quarterly reports. Personal finance wisdom he read aloud. "Very thoughtful, sweetheart. This will definitely help me stay organized." What I didn't tell him is that the bookmark came from the same company that printed motivational materials for Bennett Capital Holdings. The same company that had produced our employee handbooks and corporate mission statements. If he ever bothered to look closely at the copyright information, he'd find it interesting. Marcus was examining his cufflinks with the intensity of a gemologist, turning them over in his palm, squinting at the details. Something about his expression told me he was seeing exactly what I wanted him to see. "These are interesting," he said carefully. "Where did you get them?" "Made a small boutique in the financial district," I replied. "Very exclusive designer. You probably wouldn't know them." His face had gone slightly pale, but he managed a weak smile. "They're very unique." From his wheelchair near the fireplace, Grandfather Thomas was watching our exchange with the kind of knowing look that made me wonder exactly how much he'd figured out over the years. At 82, he was still sharp as a blade. The only member of my family who'd ever treated my questions about business as legitimate curiosity rather than naive intrusion. "Chow always had the best taste in this family," he said quietly, using the Vietnamese term of endearment that had always made me feel special, even when others couldn't see it. Now it was my turn to receive gifts, the annual reminder of exactly how my family viewed my place in their world. Mom handed me a beautifully wrapped box from Saks Fifth Avenue. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a gift card, $100 to help you update your professional wardrobe," she said with the kind of smile that managed to be both generous and condescending. "I thought you might enjoy picking out some nicer pieces for work." The implication was clear. My clothes weren't good enough. My appearance was somehow lacking. At 32, I still needed my mother's guidance on how to dress like a successful adult. Dad's gift was even more pointed. A hardcover book titled Personal Finance for Young Professionals, complete with chapters on budgeting, debt management, and building credit. The bookmark he just received would fit perfectly inside. "I thought this might help you understand some of the concepts we discuss at family dinners," he said. "Banking principles, investment strategies, that sort of thing. Knowledge is power after all." I flipped through the pages, noting the highlighted sections on student loan repayment and entry-level salary negotiation. Someone had clearly spent time marking the passages they thought I needed most. "Thank you, Dad," I said, keeping my voice level. "I'm sure I'll learn a lot from this." What neither of them knew was that I'd written the foreword for the updated edition of this exact book published under a pen name 6 months ago. The author had specifically requested my input on fintech innovations and cryptocurrency integration in modern banking. My ghost-written words were sitting right there in their hands, completely invisible to them. Marcus was still fidgeting with his cufflinks, periodically glancing at me with an expression I'd never seen before. It wasn't the usual mixture of pity and irritation he typically wore around me. This was something closer to fear. I decided to test my theory. "Marcus, those cufflinks look perfect on you," I said, watching his reaction carefully. "The craftsmanship is really exceptional. Did you notice how detailed the metalwork is?" He looked down at his wrists, where he'd already put them on. "Yeah, they're very well made. The logo design is particularly intricate." Logo design. He'd definitely seen it. "I'm glad you appreciate quality when you see it," I continued. "Not everyone recognizes good work, especially when it's not obviously expensive." From across the room, I caught Grandfather Thomas hiding a smile behind his brandy snifter. He was enjoying this performance as much as I was. Mom began gathering up the wrapping paper with the efficiency of someone who'd been hosting perfect Christmas celebrations for decades. "Well, it wasn't that lovely," she said. "Nothing quite like family traditions, is there?" But I noticed she was holding, and Dad had already set his bookmark aside without really looking at it. Only Marcus was still examining his gift, turning his wrists to catch the light on the metal. I excused myself to use the powder room, pulling out my phone once I was safely behind a locked door. Marcus's behavior confirmed what Izzy had texted earlier. He was definitely onto something, but he hadn't put all the pieces together yet. I typed a quick message to Izzy. He found the logo. Time to accelerate the timeline. Her response came immediately. "FBI raid confirmed for Monday a.m. Detective Morrison says they have everything they need. Perfect timing." By Monday morning, Marcus would have much bigger problems than mysterious cufflinks and suspicious sisters. When I returned to the living room, Marcus was Googling something on his phone, trying to be subtle about it. The blue light from his screen reflected off his cufflinks, making the tiny Bennett Capital Holdings logo glint like a warning. Grandfather Thomas caught my eye and nodded almost imperceptibly toward the dining room where Maria was lighting candles for dinner. Time for the main event. "Dinner is served," Mom announced, rising from her chair with practiced grace. "Let's continue our celebration in the dining room, shall we?" As we filed toward dinner, I noticed Marcus lagging behind, still staring at his phone screen. Whatever he'd found had clearly rattled him more than he was letting on. Good. I'd spent 8 years being underestimated by this family. Tonight, the tables were finally going to turn. And Marcus, with his new cufflinks and his growing suspicions, was about to get a front row seat to the show. The Bennett family dining room was a monument to old money restraint, all dark mahogany and crystal chandeliers that had witnessed 4 generations of power dinners and family drama. Tonight, as we took our traditional seats around the polished table, the hierarchy was as rigid as it had been since childhood. Dad commanded the head of the table like a general surveying his troops. Mom sat to his right, the perfect picture of Boston society elegance in her emerald cocktail dress. Marcus claimed his spot to Dad's left, the heir apparent's position he'd occupied since college. I took my assigned place at the far end, close enough to participate but distant enough to remember my status. Only Grandfather Thomas broke the pattern, positioned in his wheelchair at the table's midpoint like a chess master, watching all the pieces move. Marcus just closed another major deal with Pemberton Industries, Dad announced as Maria served the first course. $50 million in new business. That's what real banking looks like. Building relationships that span generations. I cut into my duck carefully, letting the praise wash over Marcus while I planned my opening move. Pemberton Industries had been making headlines recently, though not for the reasons Dad would want to discuss at a family dinner. That's impressive, Marcus, I said, my voice carrying just the right note of admiration. Pemberton's been in the news quite a bit lately. Their CFO, Thomas Crawford, seems like an interesting character. Marcus nearly choked on his wine. How do you know Crawford's first name? The question came out sharper then. He'd intended drawing surprised looks from our parents. I maintained my innocent expression, the same one I'd perfected during 8 years of playing the harmless little sister. Financial news is fascinating once you start paying attention, I replied, especially when it covers regulatory investigations and offshore banking structures. Marcus was now staring at me with an undisguised alarm, but Dad just laughed dismissively. Bonnie, you work at a community bank processing car loans and small business deposits, he said. These complex international transactions are beyond your understanding. I took another bite of duck, savoring both the perfectly prepared meat and the perfect setup Dad had just given me. You're right, Dad. I probably don't understand the complexities of routing $50 million through 7 different offshore accounts to hide tax liabilities. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus had gone completely white, his fork frozen halfway to his mouth. Even Mom stopped her usual commentary about the meal preparation. I continued as if I'd mentioned the weather. It's just that the financial press has been very detailed about Pemberton's creative accounting methods. The Wall Street Journal's investigation was particularly thorough. Marcus was frantically trying to catch Dad's eye, making subtle hand gestures that screamed, "Stop talking about business." But Dad was oblivious to his son's panic. Bonnie darling, Mom interjected with forced lightness. Perhaps we should discuss something more appropriate for Christmas dinner. How's your little job at the community bank? The word little hung in the air, like an insult disguised as affection. 3 years of playing this role, and she still couldn't resist the condescending diminutives. Oh, it's wonderful, I said brightly. I've learned so much about banking operations, regulatory compliance, and federal oversight procedures. Did you know that banks have to report any suspicious transactions over $10,000 to the Treasury Department within 15 days? Marcus was now openly staring at me, his breathing shallow and rapid. The specific knowledge I was displaying wasn't the kind of thing community bank tellers typically discussed at family dinners. That's very nice, dear, Mom said, clearly ready to change the subject. Marcus, tell us about your recent travels. Wasn't there a business trip to the Cayman Islands? If I hadn't been watching, Marcus carefully, I might have missed the way his entire body tensed at Mom's innocent question. The Cayman Islands weren't exactly a vacation destination for a Boston banking executive unless he was conducting the kind of business that required absolute privacy. Actually, Marcus, I said casually, I'm curious about something. That Pemberton wire transfer last Tuesday, the $3 million transaction through the Cayman subsidiary. How exactly does that routing work? The compliance procedures must be incredibly complex. Marcus dropped his fork entirely, the silver clattering against his plate like a gunshot in the suddenly silent room. His face had progressed from white to a sickly green color that matched Mom's dress. How do you know about that specific transaction? He whispered. The question hung between us like a loaded weapon. Only 3 people in the world knew the exact amount and routing details of that Tuesday transfer, Marcus Thomas Crawford, and whoever had flagged it for federal investigation. I smiled the same innocent smile I'd been wearing all evening. Like I said, financial news is really fascinating when you dig into the details. Grandfather Thomas was watching our exchange with undisguised delight, his eyes bright with an alertness that made him seem decades younger. He'd always been the sharpest mind in our family, and I could see him putting pieces together faster than anyone else at the table. Dad, meanwhile, was growing frustrated with the conversation's direction. Bonnie, I don't know where you're getting this information, but family dinner isn't the place for wild speculation about business matters. You don't understand. You're absolutely right, Dad. I agreed. I'm sure I'm just confused about the technical details. After all, what would a community bank teller know about international wire transfers and regulatory investigations? Marcus was now gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles had turned white. He kept opening his mouth as if to speak, then closing it again without making a sound. I decided to push a little harder. It's just that I read the most interesting article about cryptocurrency money laundering, I continued conversationally. Apparently, some financial institutions have been using digital currencies to obscure traditional wire transfers. The federal investigators have developed some really sophisticated tracking methods. That was it. Marcus shot to his feet so quickly his chair nearly toppled backward. I need to make a phone call, he announced, his voice cracking slightly. Excuse me. As he rushed from the dining room, his phone already pressed to his ear. I caught Grandfather Thomas's eye. The old man was definitely enjoying the show. Mom watched Marcus's hasty exit with confusion. Is everything all right with him tonight? He seems very agitated. Probably just business stress, I suggested helpfully. The banking industry has been under a lot of regulatory pressure lately. I'm sure it's nothing serious. Through the doorway, I could hear Marcus's voice from the hallway, low and urgent, though I couldn't make out the words. Whatever conversation he was having, it wasn't going well. Dad was frowning at Marcus's empty chair. I don't understand what's gotten into him lately. He's been acting strangely for weeks. Maybe he's worried about something I offered. You know how sensitive financial professionals can be about compliance issues. When Marcus returned 5 minutes later, his face had somehow become even paler. He sat down without explanation, avoiding eye contact with everyone, especially me. The rest of dinner passed in uncomfortable near silence, punctuated only by Mom's increasingly desperate attempts at holiday conversation. Marcus pushed food around his plate without eating, checking his phone obsessively under the table. I ate my dinner calmly, enjoying every bite while watching my brother slowly realize that his carefully constructed criminal enterprise was unraveling in real time. As Maria cleared the dessert plates, Dad finally broke the tension. Marcus, what the hell is wrong with you tonight? But Marcus wasn't listening. He was staring at his phone screen, reading something that had drained what little color remained in his face. I already knew what message he'd received. Detective Morrison and the FBI Financial Crimes Unit had moved faster than expected. By Monday morning, Marcus would be facing federal charges for money laundering, wire fraud, and conspiracy. But tonight, he was just my big brother, finally understanding that his little sister knew exactly what kind of man he'd become. By the time Maria brought out the chocolate torte and coffee service, the tension at our dining table was thick enough to cut with a knife. Marcus had barely touched his food, spending more time staring at his phone than participating in conversation. Dad's patience was wearing thin, and Mom's attempts at festive chatter were becoming increasingly forced. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. 8 years of careful planning had led to this exact dinner, this precise configuration of family dynamics, this perfect storm of circumstance and revelation. Dad stood up with his coffee cup, the gesture that traditionally signaled his intention to deliver one of his paternal lectures. The wine had made him more philosophical than usual, and I could see him gathering steam for what he probably considered motivational tough love. Bonnie, he began, his voice carrying the authority he'd cultivated through decades of running board meetings. It's Christmas, and I think it's time for some honest family conversation. Marcus looked up from his phone with alarm, clearly recognizing the danger signals. Dad, maybe we should just enjoy dessert and leave business discussions for another time. But Dad waved him off dismissively, too focused on his mission to notice his son's desperation. No, Marcus, this needs to be said. Bonnie is 32 years old, and it's time she faced some hard truths about her situation. Here it comes, I thought, settling back in my chair with what I hoped looked like resigned acceptance. The annual Christmas Eve lecture about my failures, my limitations, my inability to live up to the Bennett family standards. Bonnie, Dad continued, his tone mixing disappointment with what he probably thought was compassion. You're still working at that little community bank, making what? $45,000 a year. Still living in that studio apartment in Somerville, driving that beat-up Toyota, wearing clothes from discount stores. Mom nodded approvingly, adding her own observations. The car is becoming quite embarrassing, dear. When you arrived tonight, I had to explain to the neighbors that it belonged to the family. And your apartment, well, at your age, you really should be able to afford something more appropriate. Each word was a calculated cut, designed to make me feel small and unsuccessful. They'd perfected this routine over the years, this coordinated attack on my self-esteem disguised as family concern. Still broke, Bonnie? Dad asked with the kind of smile that wasn't really a smile. Still counting pennies and struggling to make ends meet. When are you going to accept that your pride isn't paying your bills? Marcus was frantically trying. to signal Dad to stop making increasingly desperate gestures under the table, but Dad was completely oblivious to his son's panic. He was too invested in his performance, too convinced of his own righteousness to notice that something was fundamentally wrong with tonight's family dynamics. "Look at your brother," Mom added, gesturing toward Marcus with obvious pride. Stanford MBA executive position at the bank proper. Car proper clothes, proper apartment on Beacon Hill. He understood how to build success the right way. Marcus looked like he was about to be sick. The irony of using him as an example of proper success while federal investigators were building a criminal case against him was almost too perfect. "Maybe it's time you accepted reality," Dad continued, his voice gaining momentum. "Maybe it's time you swallowed your pride and took that junior teller position I offered you at Bennett Trust Bank. The family business could teach you what real success looks like." The family business. The institution that was about to become a subsidiary of my company within the next 6 months. The traditional banking operation that was already obsolete compared to the fintech revolution I'd been building. I looked around the table at my family, these people who'd spent 8 years believing their own narrative about my failures, and felt something shift inside me. The anger I'd been carrying, the hurt from years of condescension and sabotage, the frustration of being consistently underestimated, all of it crystallized into perfect clarity. "Still broke, Dad?" I asked quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. The question hung in the air between us, deceptively simple but loaded with implications that only I fully understood. "I'm sorry if the truth hurts," he replied, his tone suggesting he thought he was being kind by being brutal. "But someone in this family needs to be honest with you. Your current path isn't working. It's time to try something different." Marcus was now literally grabbing Dad's sleeve, whispering urgently for him to please stop talking, please change the subject, please just let this dinner end peacefully. But Dad shook him off, too committed to his intervention to recognize the warning signs. Grandfather Thomas was leaning forward in his wheelchair, his eyes bright with anticipation. Unlike everyone else at the table, he seemed to understand that something momentous was about to happen. I reached into my purse slowly, deliberately, my fingers finding the smooth cover of the Forbes magazine I'd been carrying all evening. This was it. 8 years of planning, 8 years of building. 8 years of letting them believe their own lies about who I was and what I was capable of. "Actually, Dad," I said, my voice gaining strength with each word, "I have something for you. Something that might change your perspective on my current situation." Marcus had gone completely silent, his face pale with the kind of terror that comes from watching a carefully constructed world begin to collapse. He knew something was coming even if he couldn't guess exactly what. Mom looked curious despite herself, probably expecting another one of my inadequate attempts to defend my lifestyle choices. Dad just looked impatient, ready to dismiss whatever excuse or explanation I was about to offer. But Grandfather Thomas was smiling, really smiling, for the first time all evening. I pulled the Forbes magazine from my purse, keeping it folded, the cover hidden from view. My heart was pounding, but my hands were steady. This was the moment I'd been rehearsing in my mind for 3 years, ever since I'd first made the Forbes 30 under 30 list and decided to save the revelation for maximum impact. "A little Christmas education." I continued, meeting Dad's eyes directly. "Something I think you'll find very enlightening about your assumptions regarding my financial situation." The magazine felt heavy in my hands, weighted with the power to completely transform every relationship in my family. Once I revealed what was on that cover, there would be no going back. No more pretending to be the family failure. No more playing the role of the disappointing daughter. Just the truth in all its devastating glory. Marcus whispered something that sounded like "oh shit" under his breath, but everyone else was focused on the folded magazine in my hands. Time to show them exactly how wrong they'd been about everything. Time to change the Bennett family legacy forever. I unfolded the Forbes magazine slowly, deliberately, savoring every second of anticipation as the glossy cover revealed itself inch by inch. First came the familiar red masthead, then the date marking it as the latest year-end finance leader's special issue, and finally, in full-color glory, my own professional headshot staring back at my family. The headline blazed across the cover in bold white letters, "The Hidden Billionaire. How Bonnie Bennett Built a $2.8 billion Empire in Secret." Below that, in smaller but equally devastating text, "From family rejection to financial revolution." The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't just quiet, it was the complete absence of sound, as if the entire world had stopped breathing. Even the antique grandfather clock in the corner seemed to pause its steady ticking. Dad's coffee cup slipped from his fingers, hitting his dessert plate with a sharp crack that shattered the crystal. Silence. The dark liquid spread across the white tablecloth like spilled ink. But nobody moved to clean it up. Nobody moved at all. Mom's mouth opened and closed several times without producing any sound. Her perfectly applied lipstick making her look like a fish gasping for air. Her eyes kept darting between the magazine cover and my face, as if she couldn't quite process that they were the same person. Marcus grabbed the magazine from my hands with shaking fingers, holding it so close to his face I thought he might climb inside it. As he read, his breathing became increasingly rapid and shallow, like someone having a panic attack. "This can't be real." Dad finally managed, his voice hoarse and uncertain. "This has to be some kind of elaborate joke. Photoshop. A prank." His denial was so desperate, so complete, that I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "Page 23 has the full interview, Dad," I said calmly, my voice cutting through his disbelief like a blade. "Page 31 contains a detailed breakdown of Bennett Capital Holdings' $8 billion portfolio. Page 37 covers our technological innovations that are revolutionizing the financial industry." Marcus was reading aloud now, his voice cracking with each word. "Holy fucking shit. Youngest self-made female billionaire in America. Revolutionary fintech platform, artificial intelligence banking systems. Cryptocurrency integration." "Language, Marcus," Mom whispered automatically. But her heart wasn't in the correction. She was staring at the magazine like it contained the secrets of the universe. Dad lunged for the magazine, practically wrestling it away from Marcus. "This cannot be real," he repeated, scanning the pages frantically. "I would have known. Someone would have told me. The banking community would have mentioned." "Actually," I said, standing up and walking to the sideboard where I'd left my purse. "They did mention it, multiple times. Bloomberg covered our Series C funding round 2 years ago. The Wall Street Journal featured our AI platform last spring. CNBC interviewed our CTO about blockchain security protocols in September." I pulled out my tablet and set it on the table, the screen displaying Bennett Capital Holdings' real-time stock ticker. The numbers were beautiful: market capitalization chapter 2. $8 billion, up 12% from the previous quarter. "You just weren't paying attention," I continued, "because you'd already decided I was irrelevant." Bennett Capital, Mom whispered, her voice barely audible. "You named your company after our family." I looked at her directly, letting her see the years of accumulated hurt and anger in my eyes. "Actually, Mom, I am the Bennett family now. The successful part, anyway. The part that actually matters in the financial world." Marcus was hyperventilating now, the magazine trembling in his hands as he read through the article. When he reached the section about my educational background and early career challenges, his face went completely white. "It says here that your mother made phone calls to sabotage your early job applications," he read aloud. "Multiple sources confirmed that Patricia Bennett contacted Boston Financial institutions to warn them against hiring her daughter." The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Mom's face crumpled as she realized her secret was not only exposed, but published in the most prestigious financial magazine in America. "I was protecting our family reputation," she said weakly. But even she didn't sound convinced anymore. "You were protecting your own ego," I corrected. "You couldn't stand the thought that your daughter might succeed without your permission, so you sabotaged me before I could even try." Grandfather Thomas was applauding slowly from his wheelchair, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the stunned silence. He was the only person at the table who looked genuinely delighted by the revelation. "I knew it," he said, his voice stronger than I'd heard it in years. "Chow, tell them about the seed funding. Tell them about 2016. Dad whipped around to stare at his father. "What seed funding? What are you talking about?" I smiled, feeling the final piece of my revenge falling into place. "Actually, Grandfather secretly provided my initial $2 million through an anonymous shell company. He believed in me when nobody else in this family did." The revelation hit Dad like a physical blow. His own father had funded my company while he was busy dismissing my potential. The betrayal was written across his face in stark, undeniable terms. $2 million, he whispered. "You gave her $2 million without telling me." "Best investment I ever made," Grandfather Thomas replied without apology. "Look at the returns. 2 million became 2.8 billion in 8 years. Show me another investment with that kind of performance. Marcus was flipping through the magazine pages frantically, stopping at a section that made his face go gray. Bonnie, he said, his voice barely a whisper. This article mentions Bennett Capital Holdings acquiring stakes in regional banks, including Bennett Trust Bank. I nodded calmly. 34% to be exact. Purchased through various shell companies over the past 2 years. Combined with grandfather's 15% original stake, that gives us effective control. The words hit Dad like a series of hammer blows. His bank, his legacy, his life's work was already mine. Had been mine for months without him even knowing it. You can't do this, he said, but there was no authority left in his voice. Only desperation. Actually, the hostile takeover paperwork was filed last week. Bennett Trust Bank will be fully integrated into Bennett Capital Holdings by February. Mom burst into tears, her carefully composed facade finally cracking completely. Not quiet, dignified tears, but ugly, desperate sobs that shook her entire body. You're destroying everything we built, she managed between gasps. No, I said, my voice steady and cold. I'm building something better. Something that doesn't require sabotaging family members to maintain power. The magazine lay open on the table between us, my face smiling up from the cover, surrounded by headlines about innovation, success, and transformation. 8 years of planning had led to this moment. This perfect convergence of revelation and justice. But as I looked around the table at my destroyed family, I realized this was only the beginning. The real reckoning was just getting started. Now that the initial shock was wearing off, I could see my family's minds starting to work again, processing the magnitude of what I'd just revealed. It was time to explain exactly how methodically I'd planned their downfall. I opened my tablet and began swiping through presentation slides I'd prepared. Months ago, knowing this moment would eventually come. The first slide showed Bennett Capital Holdings' corporate structure, a complex web of subsidiaries and partnerships that spanned 3 continents. Let me walk you through my 8-year business plan, I said, my voice taking on the tone I used in boardrooms when explaining hostile takeovers to nervous executives. After Harvard Business School, when this family rejected my desire to start from the bottom and learn the industry properly, I decided to build something that would make your traditional banking methods look antiquated. Dad was staring at the tablet screen like it contained alien technology. The corporate structure diagram showed connections to companies he'd heard of, but never imagined were part of a single empire. While Marcus was learning creative accounting techniques to hide offshore transactions, I was developing legitimate wealth-building strategies. I continued watching my brother's face grow paler with each word. While Dad was rejecting every technological innovation that could have saved Bennett Trust Bank, I was revolutionizing the entire financial industry. The next slide displayed our client roster, names that made Dad's jaw literally drop open. Tesla's entire cryptocurrency portfolio, 3 different unicorn startups, the payment processing system for Amazon's new financial services division, government contracts with the Treasury Department for blockchain security, research. These companies don't trust their money to anyone without impeccable credentials and cutting-edge technology, I explained. They certainly don't work with banks that still use software from the 1990s and refuse to adapt to digital transformation. Marcus was frantically scrolling through his phone, probably trying to verify what I was showing them. What he was finding was making him look increasingly sick. This is impossible, he said, his voice cracking. You can't build a $2.8 billion company in 8 years without anyone in the family knowing about it. I smiled at his naivety. Marcus, you've been embezzling money for 3 years, and you thought you were being subtle. Did you really think I couldn't hide a legitimate business? The accusation hit him like a physical blow, but I wasn't done yet. Speaking of which, I continued pulling up another file on my tablet. Let's discuss the Pemberton Industries situation. Marcus, would you like to explain to Mom and Dad how you've been laundering money through offshore accounts? Marcus shot to his feet so quickly his chair toppled backward. What the fuck are you talking about? You can't prove anything. I can prove everything, I replied calmly. $12 million moved through 7 different offshore accounts to hide Thomas Crawford's tax evasion. Wire transfers routed through Bermuda, the Cayman Islands, and Switzerland. Digital currency conversions to obscure the paper trail. I have documentation of every single transaction. His face had gone from pale to green, the color of someone who realizes their entire world is collapsing around them. Actually, I personally provided that evidence to Detective Ray Morrison at the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit 6 months ago, I added. It was my civic duty to report financial crimes, even when they're committed by family members. Mom gasped audibly, her hand flying to her throat in a gesture of pure horror. You turned in your own brother. Your own family, I looked at her directly, letting her see the steel in my eyes. I reported a criminal who happens to share my DNA. There's a difference. Dad was trying to process the implications, his business mind finally grasping the scope of what I'd accomplished. How long have you been planning this? He asked, his voice hollow. Since the day you told me I needed to learn humility before joining the family business, I replied. Since the day Mom made her first phone call to sabotage my job applications. Since the day you all decided I was the family disappointment who would never amount to anything. The tablet screen now showed financial projections, market analysis, and growth charts that painted a picture of unstoppable success. Bennett Capital Holdings wasn't just profitable. It was dominant in every sector we'd entered. But the real masterpiece I continued advancing to the final slide was acquiring control of Bennett Trust Bank without any of you noticing. 34% through shell companies, plus grandfather's 15% original stake gives us 49%. Combined with public shareholders who are increasingly dissatisfied with current management, we have effective control for a complete hostile takeover. Dad's face went through several color changes as he processed the mathematics of his own destruction. You can't just steal a bank that's been in our family for generations. I'm not stealing anything, I corrected. I'm saving it. Bennett Trust Bank has been hemorrhaging money for 3 years because you've refused to modernize. Your loan portfolio is underwater, your technology infrastructure is obsolete, and your regulatory compliance is questionable at best. Just then, Marcus's phone buzzed with an incoming text. He glanced at the screen and went completely white, his hands shaking as he read the message. What is it? Mom asked, but Marcus couldn't seem to form words. I already knew what he'd received. Detective Morrison had moved faster than I'd expected. Let me guess, I said helpfully. Your lawyer wants an emergency meeting about federal investigators accelerating their timeline. Marcus nodded mutely, looking like he might vomit on Mom's imported Italian tablecloth. The FBI raid is scheduled for Monday morning, I explained to my stunned family. SEC investigation begins the same day. Marcus will be facing charges for money laundering, wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. Dad will be under investigation for regulatory violations and failure to report suspicious activities. The silence that followed was broken only by Mom's quiet sobbing and the distant sound of Christmas carolers somewhere in the neighborhood, their cheerful voices a surreal counterpoint to the devastation unfolding in our dining room. Grandfather Thomas was still smiling, watching the scene with the satisfaction. Grandfather Thomas was still smiling, watching the scene with the satisfaction of someone whose long-term investment had finally paid off beyond his wildest dreams. This is what happens when you underestimate people, I said, looking around the table at the wreckage of my family's arrogance. This is what happens when you choose cruelty over support, sabotage over encouragement, tradition over innovation. Marcus's phone buzzed again, and this time when he looked at the screen, his face crumpled completely. Emergency federal warrant, he whispered. They're coming tonight. Through the tall windows, I could hear the distant sound of sirens growing closer, their wailing cry cutting through the crisp December air, like a prophecy of justice finally arriving. My family's reign was over. My empire was just beginning. The dining room had become a war zone of emotions and revelations. But I wasn't finished yet. There was one more layer to my revenge that my family needed to understand. One final twist that would show them just how completely they'd underestimated me. We need to move this conversation somewhere more private, I announced, standing up from the table. The library will be more appropriate for what comes next. Dad looked confused by the sudden change of venue, but Grandfather Thomas was already maneuvering his wheelchair toward the doorway. He understood that old money families didn't conduct their most serious business in dining rooms even during family crises. Marcus tried to bolt for the front door, but I blocked his path with a simple gesture. You're not going anywhere, big brother. Not until we finish this conversation. The library had always been Dad's sanctuary, all dark wood paneling and leather-bound first editions that were more about displaying wealth than actual reading. Tonight, it felt like a courtroom where final judgments were about to be rendered. As we settled into the familiar hierarchy of chairs, I noticed how different the power dynamics had become. Dad no longer commanded the room from behind his massive desk. Mom had retreated to the corner love seat, still crying quietly. Marcus stood near the window like a trapped animal looking for escape routes. Only Grandfather Thomas seemed comfortable, positioned in the center where he could observe everything with the sharp eyes of someone who'd built the original Bennett fortune. "Let me explain exactly how methodical this has been," I began, pulling up files on my tablet that I'd prepared specifically for this moment. "Every move I've made over the past 8 years has been calculated to bring us to this exact point." The first slide showed a timeline spanning from 2016 to 2024, with key milestones marked in red. Each date represented a strategic decision designed to accelerate my family's downfall while building my own empire. When you rejected me after Harvard, I didn't just start a company, I began documenting everything. Every condescending comment, every sabotaged opportunity, every instance of deliberate humiliation. I built a case study in toxic family dynamics that business schools will be teaching for decades. Mom looked up from her tears, confusion mixing with horror on her face. "You documented our private family conversations. I documented criminal behavior and emotional abuse," I corrected. "The family conversations were just context." Marcus was sweating profusely now, his expensive suit wilting under the pressure of imminent federal charges. "Bonnie, we can work something out. I can make restitution pay back whatever money you think I took." $12 million, Marcus. You stole $12 million and helped Thomas Crawford evade $40 million in federal taxes. There's no working that out. Dad finally found his voice, though it lacked any of its usual authority. "Bonnie, I understand you're angry, but destroying the family business won't solve anything. We can discuss your grievances, make changes, and bring you into the fold properly." His offer was pathetic, desperate, and about 8 years too late. "Bring me into the fold," I laughed, the sound harsh in the book-lined room. "Dad, I already own the fold. Bennett Trust Bank is mine now. Your employees will be working for me starting Monday morning." Grandfather Thomas chose that moment to make his own announcement, his voice stronger than it had been in years. "Richard, there's something else you need to know," he said, fixing his son with a stare that could have frozen hellfire. "Bonnie, tell them about the will reading that's scheduled for next week." This was the moment I'd been saving, the final nail in the coffin of their arrogance. "Grandfather Thomas updated his will last month," I said, watching Dad's face drain of color. "The 15% controlling stake he owned in Bennett Trust Bank, along with his entire personal fortune and the Beacon Hill property." Dad staggered backward like he'd been physically struck. "The house, the original stake in the bank. Everything, everything." Grandfather Thomas confirmed. "Bonnie earned it by being the only family member with actual integrity and business acumen. The rest of you are moral bankrupts and financial failures." The words hit Dad harder than any physical blow could have. His own father, the patriarch he'd spent his entire life trying to impress, had completely repudiated him in favor of the daughter he'd dismissed. Just then, my phone buzzed with a text from Izzy Chen, FBI, arriving at house now. "Victoria Sterling from Forbes has exclusive news. This is going to be huge." I looked around the library at my destroyed family, feeling a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness. The people who should have supported me, encouraged me, believed in me, were now facing the consequences of their cruelty and corruption. Through the tall windows, I could see car headlights turning into our circular driveway. Multiple vehicles moving with the purposeful efficiency of law enforcement. "Detective Morrison and his team are here," I announced calmly. "Marcus, I suggest you prepare yourself for a very different kind of Christmas morning than you were expecting." The sound of car doors slamming echoed through the quiet Beacon Hill neighborhood, followed by the heavy footsteps of federal agents walking up our brick pathway. Marcus was hyperventilating now, his Stanford MBA and executive training completely useless in the face of federal criminal charges. Mom looked between her son and me, finally understanding that this wasn't some temporary family squabble that could be resolved with Christmas dinner and forced forgiveness. "You really did this," she whispered. "You really destroyed your own family." "I destroyed a criminal enterprise that happened to be run by people who share my DNA," I corrected. "There's a difference." The doorbell rang, its formal tone cutting through the library like a funeral bell. Grandfather Thomas was smiling with genuine pride, watching his granddaughter claim victory in a war that had been building for 8 years. As the sounds of federal agents entering our home echoed through the hallways, I realized that this moment represented more than personal revenge. It was the complete transformation of what the Bennett name would mean in Boston's financial community. No longer would we be known as a traditional banking family clinging to outdated methods and corrupt practices. We would be known as revolutionaries who rebuilt the industry from the ground up. Well, I would be known that way. The rest of my family was about to become a cautionary tale about what happens when arrogance meets justice. The library door opened, and Detective Morrison stepped inside, his badge gleaming under the antique chandelier light. Time for the final act of my Christmas Eve performance. Detective Ray Morrison stepped into the library with the measured confidence of a man who'd spent 20 years bringing down financial criminals. Behind him followed 3 other federal agents, their badges visible on dark suits that contrasted sharply with the warm wood, paneling and family portraits that had witnessed generations of Bennett power. Marcus Bennett, you're under arrest for wire fraud, money laundering, conspiracy to commit tax evasion, and violation of the Bank Secrecy Act, Morrison announced, pulling out handcuffs with practiced efficiency. The words hit the library like gunshots, each charge echoing off the leather-bound books that had been silent witnesses to so many family secrets over the decades. Marcus backed against the tall windows, his face a mask of terror and disbelief. "This is all her fault," he shouted, pointing at me with a shaking finger. "Bonnie orchestrated this whole thing. She set me up." Detective Morrison didn't even look in my direction. "Mr. Bennett, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As the Miranda rights continued, I watched my brother's world collapse in real time. The golden boy who'd never faced consequences for anything was finally learning what accountability looked like. "I documented your crimes, Marcus," I said calmly as the handcuffs clicked into place. "I didn't force you to commit them." Dad stepped forward with the kind of bluster that had intimidated business rivals for decades, but seemed pathetic when directed at federal agents. "This is harassment," he declared. "Our family has been pillars of the Boston financial community for 4 generations. We demand to speak with our attorneys immediately." Detective Morrison handed him a business card with the patience of someone who dealt with entitled rich people before. "Sir, the SEC investigation into Bennett Trust Bank begins Monday morning. I strongly suggest you retain excellent legal representation." Through the library windows, I could see news vans pulling up outside our gates. Victoria Sterling had clearly made good on her promise to provide exclusive coverage of the Bennett family's downfall to the financial media. Mom tried to rush toward Marcus as the agents prepared to escort him out, but another agent gently blocked her path. "My son isn't a criminal," she pleaded, her voice breaking with desperation. "This is all a misunderstanding. He's a good boy from a good family." "Ma'am," Agent Morrison replied with professional courtesy, "your son moved $12 million through offshore accounts to help Thomas Crawford evade federal taxes. We have digital records of every transaction, every phone call, every meeting. This isn't a misunderstanding." The agents began leading Marcus toward the door, but he turned back one final time, his face twisted with rage and terror. "How could you do this to your family?" he screamed at me. "How could you destroy everything Dad built?" The question hung in the air as they disappeared into the hallway, leaving behind the sound of Mom's sobs and Dad's ragged breathing. I looked around the library that had been the seat of Bennett family power for so long, feeling the weight of what I'd accomplished settling on my shoulders. It wasn't triumph exactly, but it wasn't a regret either. It was something more complex, more nuanced than simple revenge. "How could you do this to your own family?" Mom whispered, echoing Marcus's question with genuine bewilderment. I met her eyes directly, letting her see the years of accumulated pain that had led to this moment. "How could this family do what it did to me for 14 years?" I replied. "How could you sabotage your own daughter's career because you were embarrassed by her ambition? How could Dad reject my desire to learn the business from the ground up? How could Marcus steal millions while lecturing me about financial responsibility?" Grandfather Thomas spoke up from his wheelchair, his voice carrying more authority than anyone else in the room. "Patricia, you and Richard made your choices years ago," he said firmly. "You chose cruelty over kindness, sabotage over support, tradition over innovation. Bonnie chose justice." Outside, I could hear reporters setting up equipment, their voices carrying through the December air as they prepared to broadcast the downfall of one of Boston's oldest banking dynasties to the world. My phone buzzed with updates from Izzy Chen's stock market opening Monday with Bennett Trust Bank in freefall. 3 major clients are already requesting to move their accounts to Bennett. Capital Holdings. Forbes website crashed from traffic on your story. The irony wasn't lost on me. While my family was being destroyed by their own corruption, my legitimate business empire was growing stronger by the hour. Dad slumped into his leather chair, the fight finally going out of him as the magnitude of his losses became clear. The bank, the house, the family legacy, even his own father's approval. All of it was gone. What happens now? He asked quietly, looking older than his 58 years. Now you face the consequences of your choices, I replied. Marcus will probably serve 5 to 7 years in federal prison. You'll be banned from the banking industry and face significant SEC fines. Mom will be ostracized from Boston society as word spreads about tonight. And Bennett Trust Bank, he whispered, will be fully integrated into Bennett Capital Holdings by March, becoming the foundation for the most innovative financial services company in New England. Through the windows, camera flashes were lighting up the night like artificial lightning, capturing images that would appear on front pages and financial websites around the world. Grandfather Thomas was watching me with obvious pride, seeing his investment in my potential finally paying dividends beyond his wildest projections. The Bennett name will mean something different now, I said, addressing the room but speaking primarily to him. Instead of representing old money corruption and resistance to change, it will represent innovation integrity and the power of building something legitimate from the ground up. As federal agents continued their work throughout the house, confiscating documents and electronics that would provide evidence for multiple criminal cases, I felt the final pieces of my 8-year plan clicking into place. The family that had dismissed me, sabotaged me, and underestimated me was now facing the full consequences of their arrogance and corruption. And I was finally free to build the future I'd been working towards since the day they decided I wasn't worth their respect. Justice, it turned out, really was the best revenge. But as I watched my mother cry and my father crumble, I realized that victory could be just as complicated as defeat. The Bennett legacy was dead. Long live the Bennett empire. 6 months after that Christmas Eve dinner that changed everything, I stood in my corner office on the 32nd floor of the Prudential Tower, looking out over Boston Harbor as the morning sun painted the water gold. The view was spectacular, but what made it truly satisfying was knowing that every major financial institution in the city now recognized Bennett Capital Holdings as the dominant force in New England banking. The transformation had been even more dramatic than I'd projected. Marcus was serving a 7-year federal sentence at a minimum security prison in Pennsylvania, where he spent his days working in the library and writing letters that I never answered. Dad had been permanently banned from the banking industry and was facing personal bankruptcy after SEC fines totaled $2.3 million. Mom had become a social pariah among Boston's elite, forced to move from Beacon Hill to a modest apartment in Brookline. But the real victory wasn't their destruction. It was what I'd built from the ashes of their arrogance. Izzy Chen knocked on my office door, entering with her usual energy and a tablet full of updates that would have overwhelmed most CEOs. Our expansion into cryptocurrency banking had exceeded all projections, and 3 major corporations had just signed exclusive contracts for our AI-powered financial services. Your Harvard Business Review interview about family dynamics and corporate leadership has 15 million views across all platforms, she announced, settling into the chair across from my desk. Women everywhere are sharing their own stories about being underestimated by their families. The interview had been cathartic in ways I hadn't expected, discussing the psychology of family sabotage and the long-term effects of emotional manipulation had resonated with audiences far beyond the business world. Harvard Business School had even created a case study based on my experience, examining how toxic family dynamics can either destroy potential or fuel extraordinary success. Netflix secured the exclusive rights to your story, Izzy continued. 3 major studios are bidding for the movie rights. Your revenge story is inspiring an entire generation of women to stop seeking approval from people who never deserved their loyalty. The phone rang, interrupting our conversation. The caller ID showed a number I recognized but hadn't expected to see. Bonnie, it's your father, came the familiar voice, though it sounded older and more defeated than I remembered. I was wondering if we could talk, Perhaps meet for lunch this week. The request was pathetic in its transparency. Dad's legal troubles had drained his savings, and his inability to work in banking had left him financially desperate. This wasn't an attempt at reconciliation. It was a plea for help from the daughter he'd spent decades dismissing. "What did you want to discuss, Dad?" There was a long pause before he answered. The silence filled with everything he couldn't bring himself to say directly. "I've been thinking about opportunities in the financial sector," he said carefully. "Entry-level positions where someone with my experience might contribute to a growing organization." The irony was perfect. The man who'd refused to let me start from the bottom was now begging for exactly that opportunity. "Actually," I said, keeping my voice professionally neutral, "there's a community bank in Cambridge that's looking for a part-time teller. The pay is $45,000 a year, and they're very focused on serving working-class families. It's exactly the kind of humble position where someone could learn what real banking means to real people." The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know about how much my father had learned from his fall from grace. "I'll send you the contact information," I continued. "Tell them Bonnie Bennett recommended you. They'll know exactly what that means." After ending the call, I turned back to Izzy, who'd been listening with obvious amusement. "Your grandfather would have loved seeing that conversation," she said. "Thomas Bennett always said you had the perfect combination of his strategic mind and your grandmother's sense of justice." Grandfather Thomas had passed away peacefully in his sleep 2 months ago, leaving me not just his fortune and the Beacon Hill mansion, but also his final letter that I kept framed on my desk. In it, he'd written that watching me rebuild the Bennett legacy had been the greatest satisfaction of his final years. My phone buzzed with a text from Victoria Sterling at Forbes Your Story. Trending again. Bennett. Revenge has 50 million interactions this week. Ready for follow-up interview about building authentic leadership. Looking out at the Boston skyline, I could see the former Bennett Trust Bank building in the distance, now sporting the sleek Bennett Capital Holdings logo that represented everything the old institution had failed to become. We'd kept every employee who wanted to stay, retrained them on modern banking technology, and transformed the stodgy traditional bank into a fintech powerhouse that served everyone from inner-city entrepreneurs to Fortune 500 corporations. The best part wasn't the money, though. The $2 billion valuation was satisfying. It wasn't even the recognition, though being featured on the cover of Time magazine as one of the most influential people under 35 had been gratifying. The best part was proving that success built on integrity and innovation would always triumph over corruption disguised as tradition. I turned to face the camera that Victoria Sterling's film crew had set up for our follow-up interview, ready to share the lessons I'd learned from 8 years of strategic planning and family warfare. "They called me broke," I said, looking directly into the lens. "They called me a failure. They sabotaged my early career because they were embarrassed by my ambition. They were wrong about everything except one thing. I am Bennett, and Bennetts don't give up." I paused, thinking about all the women who'd reached out to share their own stories of family rejection and professional sabotage. What's your still broken story? What empire are you building in secret while people underestimate you? Remember this: the best revenge isn't getting even. It's getting so far ahead. Success is the ultimate vindication, but only if you build it with integrity. As the camera stopped rolling, I looked out over the city where my family had once represented old money, power now transformed into something entirely new. The Bennett name still commanded respect in Boston's financial district, but for completely different reasons. Sometimes the best way to honor your family legacy is to completely rebuild it from the ground up. And sometimes the people who underestimate you the most are the ones who taught you exactly how strong you really are.